You know, I'm always sort of happy to see Friday like most people, but I'm looking at the numbers, Vlad, that we are looking at in terms of COVID-19, and it's stunning. We are absolutely going in the wrong direction, and it's sort of disheartening sort of every single day to be chronicling the deaths, chronicling the new cases, and wondering just how are we going to turn this thing around?
You know, Anne-Marie, it's such a good point. I can only say from experience here in New York City, which was for the early days of the pandemic, the epicenter of the pandemic, where we were in this period where we were seeing the infections rising across the state, and then we started to see the death toll. And it was, I think we talked about this during that moment where here you would constantly hear sirens, ambulance sirens. It never went away. It was sort of almost like an always on. You could always hear it, and it was so heartbreaking. And when you look at these numbers, when you look at the trend over the last just 3 or 4 weeks, when you look at the information that the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, 1 month ago, the Vice President was declaring that there was not a second wave, and yet, Anne-Marie, we never actually left the first wave. And so it is absolutely horrific to see these numbers intensifying nationwide. So that is where we begin with these alarming details of the coronavirus pandemic. These numbers are absolutely astonishing. The United States shattered its daily record of cases with 77,000 infections confirmed yesterday. Actually, Anne-Marie, this morning, I had to do a double take when I saw that number. 77,000 infections confirmed yesterday. This comes as the White House Coronavirus Task Force considers implementing stricter safety restrictions in certain states where cases are spiking, especially in Texas and Florida and South Carolina, where the daily deaths have now hit a record high. So for more on this, let us bring in Weijia Jiang, CBS News White House correspondent, who is following the latest from the White House lawn. Weijia, these recommended restrictions were outlined in an unpublished document prepared for the White House task force. It highlights states in a so-called red zone. What more can you tell us about this and why it's significant?
So there are red zones, and they're classified in 2 separate categories with regard to the number of cases and the positivity rate. And so 18 states are in the red zone for, whether they have 100 or more people per every 100,000. And the other part is the rate, which is, whether a state has 10% positivity rates increasing. And so these are really alarming numbers that we have states that essentially have to go back to where we started when the government first started to, quote, slow the spread. And you'll remember that the president announced federal guidelines for doing that, and then they lasted for 30 days, and he encouraged states to reopen. Now, this document says that those states in particular should go back to the very stringent guidelines, which of course include wearing masks, social distancing, not having gatherings of more than 10 people, etc. And so I think the bigger message is that they have not made progress, but have actually gotten worse. And that's why it's so alarming. It's also surprising that these documents are not made public. They were not published. They were given to the Coronavirus Task Force, and we're told that the federal government has received them as well. But, we haven't heard from officials sharing this news and saying, look, America, we have more than a dozen states in the red zone. We don't have any sort of restrictions between states, and this virus continues to spread from coast to coast.
So when I hear about rolling back things, getting back to some of the restrictive measures that took place before, you can't help but to think of the economy and the slowing of the economy. I mean, there are people who still haven't received their unemployment checks from sort of initially applying. But now Congress has been debating a second round of COVID-related support, financial support. The president has said he really wants to see a payroll tax cut, which really only works if you are actually on the payroll. It doesn't actually help people who don't have a job. But it's been something that he's been insisting upon to be included in this stimulus package, the next stimulus package. What do we know? Where are we on this?
Well, so we know the president really thinks that this is going to give a boost to the economy because he thinks that if there is a payroll tax cut, that means more money in people's checks and more money to go out and spend. But you absolutely nailed it, Anne-Marie. And critics say, look, it doesn't matter if there's this payroll tax cut for the millions and millions of Americans who are no longer getting a paycheck. And so the bigger questions are whether the administration is going to push to extend unemployment benefits, which expire at the end of this month, whether there's going to be a second round of stimulus checks, and what else they're going to do, for example, put a moratorium on rent for people or mortgages. And these are things that, you know, they say are on the table, but they have not committed to. And so we continue to press the White House about what the next package is going to look like. But we do know for certain that the president has been talking about a payroll tax cut even before the pandemic. So I imagine that's something he will continue to push for.
Weijia, as you know, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg spoke with Dr. Anthony Fauci in a rare interview yesterday. I want to play a little bit of their conversation.
And it's really disappointing that we still don't have adequate testing, that the credibility of our top scientists like yourself and the CDC are being undermined. And until recently, that parts of the administration were calling into question whether people should even follow basic best practices like wearing masks.
We really got to almost regroup, call a timeout. We've got to get our arms around this, and we've got to get this controlled.
So, Weijia, I think it's fascinating that Dr. Fauci has been blocked, according to many reporters, including yourself, from appearing on television interviews, but he's been doing interviews with print organizations. He did one with CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Nora O'Donnell for In Style. He's doing these webcasts, these webinars, speaking to Zuckerberg. I just think it's fascinating because he is not visible on television screens. And then you've got, as I referenced earlier at the top of the show, the Vice President of the United States, who is the head official responsible for this pandemic, in other words, as head of the coronavirus task force, who a month ago published this op-ed in which every single point that the vice president made in that op-ed has been deemed inaccurate from where we are today. And that's because the vice president is not a doctor. What is the latest on this feud between Fauci and the White House?
So Dr. Fauci himself has said that the White House does not approve his television appearances for a reason that has not been spelled out, but he's certainly finding his own way to get his message across because he is a doctor. He's not only a doctor, he is the nation's top infectious disease expert. And so, he will say the things that he believes Americans need to hear, which is that there could be 100,000 cases a day, which is that we have not even begun to see the end of this thing, and that we have to do something differently because what we're doing right now isn't working. Of course, all those things are things that the president does not necessarily want people to hear because it impacts his other priority, which is the economy. And so the evolution of this Fauci feud has been, has been quick this week. And I think right now where we are is the White House trying to tamp it down a little bit because there are frustrations. Sources say that, it's sucking up so much energy that, they have to come out and clean up these messages when someone like trade advisor Peter Navarro publishes a scathing op-ed about Fauci. They're dedicating so much time to that rather than trying to get their other messages across. We also know that Dr. Fauci and the president spoke by phone earlier this week. It was their first conversation in a month and a half, and the president claims it was all good and friendly, and they're working toward the same goal. But Vlad, my big question is whether, why he is not giving the president daily briefings. The White House insists that the president receives briefings and that the vice president is in charge of the entire effort. But, they continue to field questions about why the president is not getting these medical, scientific briefings so he can make decisions. And so, I've tried to ask, if it's not Dr. Fauci, what medical experts the president is meeting with face-to-face to get this information. And so I think, Fauci will continue to do his part to try to share what he knows and believes with the public.
Weijia, before we let you go, I want to ask you about Mary Trump's book, which has hit store shelves. She's the president's niece. She's written a tell-all book about the family. She's pretty plain about saying that, she would like to take him down. So it's a critical book. But we're getting bits and pieces of it. And I should just sort of remind everyone, it's published by Simon & Schuster, which is a division of Viacom CBS. One of the things she talks about is how frequently the Trump family used racial and ethnic slurs growing up. Mm-hmm. Are we getting any response from the White House?
We are, and they are just shutting it down, saying that this is a book of falsehoods. Mary Trump did an interview on television in which she said that the president uses the N-word as well as anti-Semitic language. And the White House says that's not true, that he just does not use those words and that kind of language. So I think we should expect to hear much more of the same, which is just an attempted takedown of Mary Trump to say that she has no idea what she's talking about and that she hasn't even seen her uncle in many years. But the president hasn't yet come out and directly addressed all the things that are in this book, including the claim that he paid somebody to take his SATs for him. And so, I imagine that will come up, especially because the book sold, I think, almost 1 million copies in its opening day. So there's definitely a hunger there from people to devour what Mary Trump has to say.
Weijia, we got like 20 seconds, but I just have to ask. It just made me think that the president has not yet weighed in on Twitter. This is a president who weighs in on Twitter with reporters he doesn't like and cable news hosts and random stories, and he retweets all sorts of random followers in his Twitter feed. Is it remarkable, within the press corps, that we haven't seen the president tweet about his niece?
I think the difference is that this is his niece, and when it comes to his family, he is very guarded. And whether there's a conflict between them or not, I think that remains the same. That he's just, does not talk about his family very often. And so I think, if he's pushed, he might. But again, this is probably very personal for him because, he was close with Mary's brother, and it's always hard to talk about family, whether you're the president or not.
That is a great point, Weijia. It is indeed. Weijia Jiang for us at the White House. As always, Weijia, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.